Very warm welcome to you, Wim. It's absolutely fantastic to have you back on the program.
Thank you.
So we are talking about spend, and one of the things I was saying to you is, in a country like South Africa, for instance, we talk about infrastructure spend. A lot of that seems to be coming from government, but you were saying that there is a role and certain infrastructure that can actually be developed by the private sector.
It can, for sure. There is a primary role for government to do the infrastructure planning, what is required over the long term for the country with respect to roads, railways, ports, airports and so on. But in the execution for discrete parts of infrastructure, government can ask private parties to participate in these investments as well. And what is important is that there is a clear framework then for this investment about what are the objectives with regards to this investment, what is the sort of financial framework, the policy framework, the regulatory framework in which that investment is made. One
of the things that I was saying to you is it seems as though when it comes to investment, the question that comes up in almost every single one of my interviews is always stability, it's regulation, it's policy, it's framework, how are all these things playing out? And I was saying to you, if you look at a country like the US, for instance, are you having as much of that discussion of if it's a new administration, is policy going to change? And you were saying that the biggest issue is track record.
Well, there is an issue of track record, or not an issue, but there is a point of track record. Private investors want to understand what the track record is of the partners they are working with. And particularly when it comes to investments for the long term, not just a 3 or 5 year investment, but maybe for 20 years. So a financial model which provides a payback on the investment for, let's say, 20 or 30 years, then the investors want to understand what the stability is with regards to the deal they have made, the framework within which it was made over that period of time. And that is not necessarily a point in Africa alone. It is a point in any, let's say, developing economy where the government needs to build up that track record. And you mentioned the example of the US. Well, the US has over the years built up a track record where even with a change of government from Democrats to Republicans, the policy frameworks stayed the same. And that's what is required in other growing economies as well.
So now let's talk about companies doing what they can to get the most out of the capital projects. And when you came in, I was saying to you, but isn't that something that companies have always done? And you were saying that it is a little bit of a different environment right now.
Well, what we see at the moment is that many large companies are investing in areas, in geographical areas where they have less invested in the past. Investments here in Africa, investments in remote places in Central Asia. Those type of investments have their additional challenges. What we see in general is that the capital spend at the moment is more technologically advanced than it was in the past. There's more technology in, so it becomes more complex. What we also see from a survey we did last year is that the way in which projects are executed, it's being done differently than in the past. There are far more parties involved. Often there are joint venture structures, you have different contractors in place and so on. And then added to that is a new geographical element as well. So capital investment of companies become, in general, more complex than they have been in the past. And particularly here in Africa, there is a big opportunity to make those type of projects a success. And in that success, local suppliers and the local government play an important role as well.
When it comes to Africa's role, in terms of is that investment out there, is there an understanding of the complexities and how those complexities can be met so that investment does come here?
I believe there is, and it depends, of course, with the country. But if you now look at, for example, the National Development Plan developed here in South Africa, it gives a framework within which a large number of investments can take place. And it provides also a sort of planning for companies who want to invest in large-scale assets on where they should fit that in within the overall plans. For any investment you need in the oil and gas industry, or, for example, in mining, you need a lot of infrastructure investments as well, be it power generation or rail capacity, port capacity and so on. So companies need to understand where the government stands in expanding that capacity so that they can basically tune in their plans on that as well.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you, if this issue now, we are in a different environment and you have to be quite careful in terms of where you're going, and you have to think about that if it's sector specific.
It depends. It is sector specific. It is country specific as well. It depends a little bit on where individual companies, but also where countries are with respect to their overall infrastructure planning.
When you talk about Africa, because sometimes I was saying to you that sometimes I find it quite funny when people talk about Africa as though it's just one country, but I mean that you're talking about states so that are completely different. South Africa, very different to Nigeria, very different to Kenya, very different to Zambia or the DRC, for instance. So when it comes to attracting that investment, and you are an investor, would like to come into, What are some of the things in terms of understanding how the continent works, that it's not, you're not talking about one geographical area, you are talking about areas that work very differently from each other?
You have differences in culture, in language, in legal frameworks, in financial frameworks all across Africa. So that is for sure one of the elements you need to take into account. Secondly, there is a difference in stage of development the individual countries are in. But thirdly, and more importantly, all investments are depending on local supply bases as well. You need local suppliers, even for the most technologically advanced investments. In Africa, you need in the end a local supply base to provide you with, let's say, basic services. Even if you talk about cleaning services, maintenance, catering, you need hotels, you need roads to take you to the property. So what you need to look into for all these investments is also where is the country you want to invest in with respect to developing its infrastructure. And some countries are far ahead, like South Africa, but still have a very interesting and massive plan ahead as well. Other countries need further development.
We talk a lot about South Africa, but what are some of the other countries that seem to be really on track when it comes to what you're talking about?
Well, on track, Ghana I always see as a country in Africa where government has a clear plan for certain investments, for infrastructure investments in support of industry. Example, if we look at Mozambique, for example, there probably the government is now working on such a plan because there are so many developments going on, is that they probably are looking now for how can we make sure that that all fits together? How can we make sure that we don't overcook the economy? Because the problem is as well, if you have a lot of investments coming in at the same time, basically the local environment can't cope with that. So you will bring in additional resources from outside, and that diminishes the local learning. Ideally, you want to plan your investments in such a way as a country that you build up the local, as I said, the local capabilities, the local supply base on the back of that as well.
Well, you were talking about track record, and it's very interesting that Ghana is a country that I've been hearing a lot about recently. And if you think about Ghana, even say 5 years ago, we weren't hearing as much in terms of development and what's going on right now. What is the Ghanaian government doing that seems to be putting them in the place now that they seem to be gaining a lot of attention in terms of investment, in terms of development, and just what's happening in the Ghanaian economy? Yeah,
I'm slightly over asked there because I don't know exactly in detail what the Ghanaian government has been doing, but you can see a couple of elements there. One is there is opportunity, so there is opportunity to invest. There is oil and gas opportunity there, and so on. Secondly, there is a stability within the regulatory framework in which the industries can invest. Now, every regulatory framework has slight changes every now and then, but it's important that it becomes predictable. Even with uncertainty, companies are willing to invest in uncertainty as long as it is predictable uncertainty, so that they can factor it in.
What I do not understand, though, if you look at a country like Zambia that recently had their elections, and they've had independence since 1964, and with these elections that happened recently, we had this, where we had people that were coming on the program speaking about one of the issues again is uncertainty. Why then, if you've got a country that's had democracy for so long, that there is still that concern, or the country hasn't seemed to quite get it right in terms of having policy and saying this is what we're about, no matter what happens in terms of administration, this will not change?
Yeah. Well, it depends on how big the shift in government is, and this is not only for Africa. Look at what happened years and years ago in the UK when Margaret Thatcher took over from a Labour government, or when François Mitterrand went into government in France. There were massive changes in policy. So every country, every now and then, runs the risk, so to speak, to run into these type of situations. But that's what democracy is about. But even then, you need to paint a picture to companies which says, listen, we're going to change certain parts of legislation, our policy framework, and so on. But this is the sort of outlook of what the new world will look like. And then, again, you take a lot of uncertainty away. Companies can start planning for that, and they will start investing into those type of economies again.
Wim, thank you so much. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming in. Well, that was Wim Plaizier, who's a partner at Kearney, discussing what leading companies are doing to get the most out of their capital projects.